The shooting stopped. That was the wrong thing to notice. When the shooting stops on a German-held ridgeline in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France in November 1944, it doesn't mean the fighting is over. It means something worse is about to begin. Private First Class Melvin Biddle of the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 1st Airborne Task Force, pressed himself flat against the frozen earth and counted what he had left. 11 rounds in his M1 Garand, 1 spare clip, 8 rounds. His canteen was empty. His left forearm had been bleeding for the past 40 minutes from shrapnel he hadn't had time to look at. His platoon, all 23 men, had pulled back 6 minutes ago when orders changed. He had not pulled back. 52 German soldiers occupied the tree line above him. 52. That number came from the intelligence briefing 3 hours earlier, and even then it was understated. What nobody in that briefing room had mentioned was that the Wehrmacht unit holding Ridgeline 447 was the 3rd Battalion of the 951st Grenadier Regiment, combat veterans of the Eastern Front who had been in this position for 11 days, who had repelled 2 previous American assaults, who had registered every approach with pre-aimed machine gun lanes, and whose commander, Hauptmann Georg Brenner, had not lost a defensive position in 4 years of war. They had laughed. That's what the survivors said afterward, some of them laughing even as they raised their hands, not because they were fools, because the idea of one American soldier standing alone in a clearing below their fortified ridgeline, staring up at 52 armed men, was the kind of thing that doesn't happen in real war. It happens in stories. Then Biddle moved. What he did in the next 3 minutes, what he did completely alone against a position that 2 full platoons had failed to take, would be called many things by many people. His commanding officer would call it the finest individual display of combat skill he had ever witnessed. The army would call it extraordinary valor in the face of the enemy. The German prisoners themselves, in a post-war interrogation that sat classified for a decade, would call him something else entirely. But before any of that, before the 33 prisoners marching downhill with their hands behind their heads, before the Medal of Honor, before the letter his mother kept folded in her Bible until the day she died, there was just one man lying in the frozen mud, deciding whether to get up. Melvin Biddle was born in Anderson, Indiana in 1923 and grew up as quietly as the flat farmland that surrounded him. He was the 3rd of 4 children in a family that raised its boys to work hard, say little, and not draw attention. His father drove a delivery truck. His mother kept chickens. By the time he was 17, Biddle could fix a tractor engine, track a deer through 2 inches of snow, and had read every Louis L'Amour novel in the county library, which, in retrospect, tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man the Army eventually got. He enlisted in 1942 at 19, not because of a recruiting poster, not because of Pearl Harbor, though that mattered. He enlisted because his older brother Tommy had gone the year before, and written home saying the paratroopers got extra jump pay, and the Biddle family was the kind of family where $50 a month extra was worth jumping out of an airplane for. That's what Melvin told people. That's not entirely why he went. He volunteered for the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment because the jump school washout rate was 60%, and Biddle had a particular relationship with hard things. He didn't fear them. He got quieter around them. His platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Dale Krause, noticed it almost immediately in training. Most guys get loud when they're scared, Krause wrote in a letter to his own wife. Biddle gets still, like a pond before a storm. That stillness is going to be worth a lot someday. His platoon called him Quiet Mel, not as a joke, as a statement of fact. In September 1944, before shipping for the Champagne campaign in southern France, Biddle received a letter from his mother. He read it once, folded it into 3 precise squares, and tucked it into the left breast pocket of his jump jacket, inside the pocket against his chest directly over his heart. He never told anyone what it said. When his bunkmate Frank Houlihan asked, Biddle just shook his head and smiled. Something to come home for, he said. He carried that letter every day from September until the frozen morning on Ridgeline 447 in November, when he lay alone in French mud with 11 rounds in his rifle and 52 German soldiers above him. And the question of whether that letter would ever be delivered home came down to what he did in the next 90 seconds. He pressed it flat against his chest with his left hand, once like a man touching a compass, and then he looked up at the ridgeline. The briefing was held at 0400 hours, in a barn 4 kilometers south of the objective, by the light of 2 shielded lanterns. Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Graves, commanding officer of the 517th PR, spread the map on a hay bale and used a stick to indicate ridgeline 447. "This is the problem," he said. The problem had been a problem for 11 days. Ridgeline 447 was a forested high-ground position approximately 400 meters long and 60 meters above the valley floor, commanding both the main road north and the only usable supply route for the 1st Airborne Task Force's advance into the Vosges. As long as the Germans held it, the American advance was stopped. 2 previous assault attempts, one by B Company of the 517th, one by a combined force from the 460th Parachute Field Artillery, had been repelled with significant American casualties. What Graves did not say in the briefing, what none of the intelligence officers said, was that the position had been reinforced. 3 days before the assault, the Wehrmacht had moved additional elements of the 951st Grenadier Regiment into the ridgeline position. Intelligence estimates said 30 to 35 defenders. The actual number, as Hauptmann Georg Brenner documented in his own war diary, a document captured 6 weeks later and translated by Army G2, was 52 combat-ready soldiers, including 2 MG-42 machine gun teams, 1 80mm mortar position, and 3 designated sniper nests covering the primary approach routes. The MG-42. If you don't know that weapon, understand this. It fired 1,200 rounds per minute. American soldiers called it Hitler's zipper for the sound it made and what it did to human bodies. The 3rd Battalion of the 951st had 2 of them, and they had pre-registered fields of fire covering every viable approach to the ridgeline. Hauptmann Brenner had repelled attacks at Kursk, at Kharkov, and at the Dnieper River crossing. He had never lost a position to frontal assault. He had never lost a position at all. B Company, 2nd Platoon, with Biddle, went in at first light, 06:23 hours, in a 3-element assault formation, 23 men moving through the tree line at the base of the ridge. They had covered 40 meters when the first MG-42 opened up. It was in the wrong place. The intelligence map showed the machine gun nest at the northeastern corner of the ridgeline. It was actually positioned 20 meters further west, covering an angle that caught the entire left element of the assault in a single sweeping burst. 4 men went down in the first 4 seconds. The platoon sergeant shouted for the right element to push through, and then the second MG-42 opened up from a position that wasn't on any map at all. A freshly dug emplacement completed just 2 nights before, completely invisible from aerial photography, cutting directly across the route that intelligence had designated as the safest approach. The plan didn't shatter, it evaporated, and then the radio crackled. Biddle heard Lieutenant Cassidy's voice change when he listened to the handset. That particular tightening, that men's voices do when the news from above is bad. Battalion had intercepted reports of German reinforcements moving toward their left flank. The assault on 447 was being deprioritized. All elements were to pull back, consolidate, and await further orders. "Pull back," Cassidy said. The men began to move. Biddle watched them go. He had pushed further right than anyone else in the assault, further right than the MG-42 coverage, into a gap between the 2 fields of fire that he had identified intuitively during the opening seconds of the German response. He was 40 meters closer to the ridgeline than anyone else in the platoon, and the gap he had found, the corridor the German guns had left between them, was real. He looked at the ridgeline. He looked at the letter inside his pocket. Then he looked at the gap. He had 11 rounds in his M1, 8 more on his belt, his knife, his training, and a dead space in the German fields of fire that would last only as long as he was moving and they were reacting, and not 1 second longer. He was alone. He had been ordered to retreat. The mission was still active. He went. He moved through the dead space like water through a crack, fast, low, angled right, using the contour of the hillside to stay below the sight lines of both machine gun positions simultaneously. It required him to keep exactly to a line no wider than his own body, adjusting his angle every few meters as the terrain shifted. One mistake in that geometry, and he walked directly into a field of fire. He didn't make mistakes. Above him, The ridgeline was everything the intelligence briefing had failed to convey. The 951st Grenadiers had been in position for 11 days. That is a long time for professional soldiers to prepare ground. The tree line was thick with fighting positions. Not hasty scrapes, but properly constructed emplacements. Log-reinforced overhead cover, interconnected by communication trenches. Their rifle positions were staggered in depth so that the forward positions could absorb an assault, while rear positions maintained fire. Their sightlines were cleared, their fields registered, their ammunition resupply organized. These were Eastern Front veterans who had been hammered into precise instruments by some of the most ferocious fighting in human history. And Hauptmann Brenner was watching. He had seen the American assault collapse, had watched it from his command position near the ridgeline center, with a calm that his men took as professional confidence. He had beaten 2 previous American assaults on this ground. He understood exactly how Americans attacked, with firepower and numbers, with artillery preparation and radio-coordinated advances. He had watched 23 men come at him this morning and had cut them down in 40 seconds. He had lit a cigarette. He had not seen the one man who didn't come back. Biddle reached the base of the ridgeline, pressed himself against the earth, listened. The MG-42 positions were still oriented toward the withdrawal route, tracking the retreating Americans. The sniper positions were scanning left. The mortar crew was calling adjustments into their radio. They were preparing to drop rounds on the withdrawal route on his platoon. His platoon. He identified the mortar position from the sound, uphill and right behind a boulder cluster, and made his decision in the time it takes to exhale. He began moving uphill. He had covered 8 meters when the trap closed. A 4-man flanking team had been positioned specifically for this eventuality. Specifically for the moment when an attacker tried to use the dead space between the MG-42 positions. Brenner had anticipated exactly this. The 4 men had lain still in a concealed position for 3 hours, waiting. They rose from the ground 6 meters to Biddle's left, so close he could see the condensation of their breath. 3 seconds. That's how long Biddle had to process what he was seeing, calculate his options, and act. He dropped flat and sideways. Not backward, not straight down, but diagonally forward and left, moving toward the ambush rather than away from it. The 4 Germans expected line of fire in the half-second before they acquired him as a target. 2 rifles fired where he had been standing. He was already rolling, coming up on one knee, and the M1 was firing 3 shots, spaced exactly, before his knee fully touched the ground. 2 of the 4 Germans went down. The other 2 dove for cover. He was already moving again. What he did in the next 90 seconds made no tactical sense, until you understand what he had already seen that no one else on that battlefield could see. The irrational thing, the thing that looked from any angle like a man walking toward his own death, was that Biddle turned directly toward the first MG-42 position. Not away from it, not around it, toward it. He moved through the trees at full speed, not slowing, not taking cover, because at this distance speed was more protective than cover. The gunner needed a stationary reference point, and Biddle refused to give him one. 30 meters, 20. The MG-42 swung to track him, but it was built for suppressing wide formations, not tracking single fast-moving targets at close range, and in the 2 seconds it took the gunner to reacquire. Biddle was inside the position. It was over in 4 seconds. He came out the other side with 9 rounds left and 1 MG-42 permanently out of the battle. Across the ridgeline, in the command trench, Hauptmann Brenner heard the shooting, the distinctive crack of an American M1, not the submachine gun of a close-quarters follow-on force, not the multiple rifles of a flanking element. 1 M1, one voice calling from positions that should have been held by his best men. He keyed his radio and called the MG-42 position. No answer. He called the flanking team. No answer. Wie viele Amerikaner sind da draußen? He demanded of his runner. How many Americans are out there? The runner didn't know. Nobody knew. The radio reports from the front edge of the position were contradictory, confusing, some of them silent entirely. Feldwebel Heinrich Wermke, commanding the ridge's right sector, tried to raise 3 positions in sequence and reached none of them. He told his men to watch the right side. His men were already watching the right side. They were watching it with the specific paralyzed attention of men who have stopped understanding what they're facing. Biddle hit the mortar position next. He came through the boulder cluster from downhill and behind, from the direction the mortar crew had least expected, because it was the most exposed approach, which meant it was the one they had covered least carefully. The mortar crew of 3 had their weapon oriented toward the valley and their attention in the same direction. He came through them fast and quiet, and the mortar would fire no more rounds that day. 12 rounds left. Wait, no, he found 2 loaded M1 clips on a dead American soldier near the first MG-42 position, a man from the earlier failed assault. 16 rounds. He checked his hands. They were steady. That steadiness cost him the next 30 seconds. He was moving toward the second MG-42 position, navigating through the communication trench, when he heard something he was not prepared for. He stopped. A child's voice. It came from a dugout, a covered shelter position built into the reverse slope, designed as an aid station and ammunition reserve. He looked through the entrance and the world of his mission changed completely. A French civilian family, a man, a woman, and a girl who could not have been more than 8 years old, still clutching a cloth doll, had been sheltering in the dugout since the Germans fortified the position. They had nowhere to go. The German position surrounded them on all sides, and the valley below was contested ground. The little girl looked up at him with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that remaining invisible is how you stay alive. Biddle made a choice in that moment that violated every principle of speed and surprise that had kept him alive for the past 4 minutes. He turned to the family and put one finger to his lips. Then he pointed downhill toward the dead space, traced the route with his finger in the air, and held up 3 fingers. 3 minutes, wait, then move. The father understood. He nodded once, very slowly. This cost Biddle the time he spent communicating with the family. 30 seconds, perhaps 40, was time he wasn't moving, and standing still on an active ridgeline is how you become a target. A German rifleman from the far side of the position caught a glimpse of movement at the dugout entrance and fired. The round went wide, but it told every German on the ridgeline that there was an American near the aid station. Biddle felt the bullet cut the air 6 inches from his face. He dropped into the communication trench and began moving again. He was bleeding from a new wound. The bullet had caught the top of his right shoulder on the edge, not deep, but enough to paint his sleeve. He shifted the M1 to his left hand, tested his grip, decided it would hold. Somewhere across the ridgeline, a German voice was shouting, not commands, but questions. Questions nobody had answers for. He stopped, not because of the wound, not because of the shooting. He stopped because his legs made the decision before his mind could, and he sat down against the wall of the communication trench, and for approximately 10 seconds he did not move at all. He had been awake for 22 hours. He had not eaten since the previous evening. His canteen had been empty for 90 minutes. The wound on his forearm from the initial shrapnel had soaked through the field dressing he'd applied in the first minutes of the assault, and was beginning to throb with a deep, rhythmic insistence that was hard to ignore. His right shoulder was bleeding. He was counting rounds in his head, 11 now, plus the 2 clips from the dead soldier, so 27 total. And he was calculating what 27 rounds meant against however many Germans were still active in the forward positions. He thought about Kraus, Staff Sergeant Dale Kraus, who had been one of the 4 men cut down by the first MG-42 burst. He wasn't sure Kraus was dead. He should have checked. You never leave a man without checking, and he hadn't checked. And now he was sitting in a German communication trench on a ridgeline with a failing body and a question he couldn't answer. He thought about the orders. Cassidy had said, "Pull back." Those words were clear. He was not operating on orders anymore. He was operating on something else, something the Army had no term for, something that was exactly halfway between duty and substance, and the refusal to allow what had already happened to the men from his platoon to have happened for nothing. Was that enough reason? Was it the right reason? He looked at the valley below through a gap in the tree line. The French civilian family hadn't moved yet. He could see the entrance to the dugout from here. They were waiting for his 3 minutes. Their 3 minutes were up. They still hadn't moved because they were afraid to, and they were afraid to because he was sitting in a trench instead of moving. His left hand went to his chest, felt the letter through the fabric. Something to come home for. He had made a promise, not in words, not officially, but in the particular way that Indiana farm boys make promises, which is the same way they do everything else, quietly, without ceremony, in a way that the world will hold them to forever. He was not going to die in this trench with 11 rounds left, and 52 Germans above him, and a little French girl clutching a cloth doll 20 meters away, waiting for a signal that a man who had stopped moving was not going to give her. He put his hand against the trench wall, pushed himself up, checked the M1 one more time. The check of a man whose hands know what to do even when his mind is only half present. And then quietly, without ceremony, he went back to work. He moved fast now, controlled but fast. The stillness that his sergeant had noted in training, the pond before the storm quality, had crystallized into something beyond stillness. It was precision, not the precision of a man performing a skill, but the precision of a man who has stopped thinking about performing and simply is. He took the second MG-42 position from the rear. The two-man crew had abandoned their pre-aimed field of fire and turned their weapon toward the center of the ridgeline, trying to cover the direction from which the impossible sounds were coming, and in doing so had turned their backs to the approach Biddle was using. The reversal in their orientation was the first visible sign of what was happening to the German defense. They had stopped operating as a coordinated unit and had begun making individual, confused decisions. Hauptmann Brenner was trying to stop it. He was on the radio, physically moving through the position with his runner, trying to establish control of a defense that was dissolving around him. He knew, with the professional certainty of an experienced commander, that his men were not facing a large American force. They would have heard artillery. They would have heard coordinated movement. They would have died differently. What he could not make himself believe, what his 4 years of training and combat experience actively refused to process, was the alternative. "Beruhigt euch," he was shouting. "Calm yourselves. Es sind nicht mehr als 3 Mann. It's no more than 3 men. His soldiers looked at him with the eyes of men who were no longer certain of the count. In the left sector, Gefreiter Franz Huber had been alone in his rifle position for 6 after the man beside him, Soldat Matthias Kiefer, went to investigate the sounds from the mortar position and did not come back. Huber was 20 years old. He had fought in Poland and in France. He was good at this. He pressed himself into his position and watched his sector with complete discipline, which was why he heard the footstep behind him, from the direction that could not have been attacked because the ridge behind it dropped 15 meters into a gully, and why he understood in the precise moment between hearing that footstep and turning to face it, that his understanding of this battle had been completely wrong. He stood up, he raised both hands, he was the first. Biddle moved, fired, dropped, moved again. He was no longer taking positions. He was improving them, and the positions were collapsing ahead of him. Men who had been dug in and disciplined for 11 days coming out of their holes with their hands up, because the thing moving through their lines wasn't something you could prepare for. It wasn't a flanking force, it wasn't a reinforcement. It was one man who had decided to be more persistent than they were. 30 meters, 20, 10, he hit the command trench. And then the puzzle from Section 5 clicks. Because what Biddle had seen in those first seconds of the ambush, what he had understood before he even consciously processed it, was the pattern of the German positions. The ambush team had given him the key to the entire ridgeline. They were positioned to cover the dead space between the machine gun nests, which meant the machine gun nests were the anchors of the entire defensive network, and the anchors were oriented toward the valley. If he destroyed the anchors first, if he came in through the dead space and took the machine gun positions, every other position on the ridgeline would be disoriented, their fields of fire wrong, their reference points gone. The irrational move was the only rational one. He saw it in 3 seconds during the ambush. He executed it across 15 minutes of combat. The command trench was occupied by Hauptmann Brenner, his runner, and 4 riflemen. Brenner turned to face him. Biddle stood 6 feet away with an M1 Garand and the look of a man who has nothing left to prove and nothing more to explain. Brenner raised his hand slowly. His 4 riflemen followed. Below, the French family emerged from the dugout, the father first, checking, then waving the woman and the little girl out. They moved downhill through the dead space, following the route Biddle had traced in the air with his finger. The girl was still holding the cloth doll. The last shot had been fired 3 minutes ago. In the tree line of ridgeline 447, there was silence. Let it breathe. American forces reached the ridgeline at 0847 hours, 26 minutes after Biddle's first shot in the flanking team ambush. They found 33 German soldiers sitting in the command trench and in 2 adjacent holding positions, hands behind their heads, guarded by one American private first class who was sitting on an ammunition crate, with his back against a log, his M1 across his knees, and a field dressing pressed against his right shoulder. The rest, 19 men, had died defending the position or had fled into the Vosges in the final minutes of the assault. Lieutenant Cassidy, who had ordered the retreat, stared at the scene for what witnesses described as a very long time before he said anything. What he finally said was, "Jesus Christ, Biddle." Biddle reportedly said, "The mortar's knocked out, Lieutenant," as if that was the most relevant information. At Army G2 interrogation facilities over the following weeks, the German prisoners from Ridgeline 447 were interviewed separately. The interrogating officers noted immediately that their accounts shared a specific quality. They all agreed on the count of American attackers, but their count kept changing when pressed. One prisoner, Feldwebel Heinrich Wermke, the senior NCO who had tried to direct the defense from the right sector, was asked directly, "How many American soldiers attacked your position on the morning of November 23, 1944? Wermke was silent for almost 15 seconds before answering. "1," he said. The interrogating officer, Second Lieutenant Gordon Allison, wrote in his report. Subject appeared embarrassed by this answer. He repeated it, without prompting, as though confirming it for himself. A second prisoner, Gefreiter Franz Huber, the first to surrender, said that during the assault he had heard his comrades calling to each other in the communication trenches, asking whether anyone had counted the Americans. The number they arrived at, shared via shouted exchange across the ridgeline as the position collapsed, was between 8 and 12. "We couldn't believe it was fewer," Huber said in his testimony, "and we especially couldn't believe, none of us could believe, what it actually was." Among themselves, the surviving prisoners had given Biddle a name. It came out in 3 separate interrogations, unprompted, from soldiers who had no contact with each other during their captivity. They called him Der Geisterjäger, the ghost hunter. Not because he was invisible, one prisoner explained, but because of what he did with positions. He appeared inside them from directions that should have been impossible, as if he had passed through the walls. "We prepared for every approach," this prisoner said. "We had covered every angle, and he found the one we did not know about, in each position, every time." Hauptmann Brenner, interviewed in a separate facility in late December, was more precise. He had had 4 years to build the habit of professional analysis, and he applied it even to the man who had captured him. "He understood our position better than some of my own officers," Brenner told his interrogator. "He did not attack, he moved through. There is a difference. An attack requires courage. What he did required something we do not have a word for." He paused. "In the Wehrmacht we study Einzelkämpfer, the lone fighter. It is a tactical concept. He was not a tactical concept. He was something you could not train for and could not train against. I have commanded soldiers for 4 years. I have faced very good soldiers." He looked at the table. "I have never faced one like him." Brenner then added, without being asked, a final observation. "He could have killed all of us. The angles were there. He chose not to. I don't know why a man who fought like that would make that choice." A long pause. "I am glad he did, and I am still not sure I understand it." The French father, a man named Edouard Renard from the village of Senons, was interviewed by an Army Civil Affairs officer 1 week later. He described the moment Biddle had appeared at the dugout entrance. The gesture of silence, the traced escape route. The 3 fingers, he said. He was bleeding. He had been fighting for minutes already, and he was bleeding, and he stopped to make sure we knew where to go. He showed us with his hand. He was very calm. My daughter asked me afterward if the American was afraid, because he looked so calm. I told her I didn't know. Later, I decided that he was afraid, but that it did not matter to him at that moment. Because we were there, and we mattered more. His daughter, he said, slept with the cloth doll for the next 4 years. The United States Army awarded Melvin E. Biddle the Medal of Honor for his actions on November 23, 1944, in the Vosges Mountains of France. The official citation reads in part, PFC. Biddle, with utter disregard for his own safety, advanced against the prepared enemy positions while armed with only his rifle. He killed or captured the members of 3 enemy machine gun crews, destroyed a mortar position, and captured 33 prisoners. Through his heroic and determined actions against a numerically superior enemy force occupying heavily fortified positions, PFC. Biddle provided the division with the freedom of movement necessary to continue the advance. His bravery was in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service. Official military language is spare and procedural. It does not tell you that the man who took that ridgeline had been awake for 22 hours, or that he carried a letter from his mother against his chest, or that he stopped in the middle of a one-man assault on 52 enemy soldiers to trace an escape route in the air for a French family sheltering in a dugout. The citation gives you the skeleton. The story gives you the man. Biddle received the Medal of Honor on December 8, 1944, 15 days after the battle, from General Alexander Patch, commanding general of the 7th Army. Photographs taken that day show a young man from Indiana who looks precisely like what he was. Quiet, a little uncomfortable with the attention, standing very straight. He came home to Anderson, Indiana in 1945. He did not speak often about the ridgeline. When pressed, in the few interviews he gave over the decades that followed, he returned consistently to the same subject. Not his own actions, but the moments he considered decisive. The family in the dugout. The escape route he traced with his finger, the girl with the doll. He never knew for certain that they made it until 1962, when a letter arrived at his home in Anderson, postmarked from Senons, France. Edouard Renard had tracked him down through Army records, through the Medal of Honor citation, through 17 years of trying. The letter was in French, translated by a professor at Ball State University who Biddle drove 2 hours to consult. In it, Renard wrote that his daughter, now 26 years old, married, with a child of her own, still had the cloth doll. Biddle read the letter, refolded it carefully, and placed it in his shirt pocket, over his heart. He was given wrong intelligence. The number he was told to expect was half the number waiting for him. The route marked safe on his map was covered by a gun that should not have existed. The position he was sent to take had repelled 2 previous assaults and was held by one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced defensive commanders. His orders changed while he was in the middle of the attack, and the unit he was part of pulled back and left him alone. He survived an ambush at point-blank range that was designed specifically to catch men doing exactly what he was doing. He stopped, in the middle of a one-man assault on a fortified position, to help a family that had nothing to do with his mission, and everything to do with why missions exist in the first place, and the men who tried the hardest to stop him, the professional soldiers who had beaten every attack thrown at their position for 11 days, who had made the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front veterans look ordinary by comparison, gave him a name when it was over, not because they had to, because they had no other word for him. If you have worn a uniform, you know what that weight feels like, the weight of being the only one left, of the plan becoming nothing, of the mission still standing in front of you, while everything that was supposed to help you complete it is gone. You know the trench. You know the moment where you decide whether to stand up. This story is not about whether Melvin Biddle was a hero. You already know the answer to that. This story is about what a man does when the answer to every tactical calculation is, this is impossible, and he decides that impossible is just another word for nobody has done it yet. For everyone else, understand that the word ordinary is doing too much work when it's applied to people. Melvin Biddle was an ordinary boy from Indiana who fixed tractors and read westerns and enlisted partly for the jump pay. He was ordinary right up until the morning he decided not to be. Not because he chose greatness, but because the alternative was to sit in a trench with a letter over his heart and a French girl waiting for a signal that was never going to come. Greatness, in that moment, was just the thing you did so you could live with yourself afterward. He kept the promise. The letter came home. And 50 years after the Vosges, a man in Anderson, Indiana, received a letter from France and drove 2 hours to have it read to him. And the only thing anyone who knew him said about that day was that when he came back, he was quieter than usual, but he was smiling. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories of extraordinary American courage. Who should we tell next? Drop their name in the comments.